Good evening, guys. This is a short video based on what we did in previous lessons on procedural programming. So we're going to learn about how programs flow, variables, constants, procedures, functions. Now, this is going to be in a two-part video so that you can go back and break things down. But this first video is going to look at procedural programming, look at string handling, file handling, and look at some of the operators that we use on a day-to-day basis when we are coding. In your exam, you will need to be able to break down code and actually analyze it to explain what is happening. So, three areas that you want to look at when you're coding are three traditional procedures that we use, such as loops, selection, and procedures and functions. Now, a loop is a type of thing in coding where we just repeat something, and there are different types of loops. We've got a for loop, and generally a for loop is used when you actually know how many times you're going to need to do this loop, because you may start at 0 and finish at 10. So you may be looping through on a number of times. And then we also have the while loop, which is if you don't know how many items are actually in your list. Now, if you've got a program where you've got things that are being added into it regularly, you'll need to use a while loop because you're never going to know how many items are actually in that list. The next thing we're going to talk about is selection. Selection is when you want to check a condition of something and have an action occur. So if the score is greater than 50, I want these things to happen in my code. And then we're going to look at procedures and functions, and I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail how they work. So the first thing we need to look at are variables. Now, a variable within a program is like a bucket. It stores information. So if you've got a bucket labeled keys, you don't generally put socks in it. You have a variable used so that you can store a piece of information, and it can be stored in lots of different data types. So you can have integers, you can have booleans, characters, so maybe you want to call it a char. Maybe you want to store a string, which is a collection of characters. So there are many different data types that you can store. Now, the thing to remember is that a variable can either change or it can be called a constant. It's similar to a variable, but it is fixed. It will never change. So if I've got, say, for example, I have the height of a door. Generally, the height of a door is never going to change. It's going to stay the same. So it's a static variable where the value will not go up or down. So some examples of variables that you might see are you've got age, you've got name, and height. Because if you've got a program, generally you could change the person's age, their name, and you could have their height as different information in a database. Now, some information that you may want to keep as a constant and you may want to keep it static is obviously the value of pi, and also a sort code in a bank. Maybe you've got a database that you're working on where you want to actually keep the account information static, so it's not going to change. So that's where you might use a constant. Now, the next slide we're going to look at, we're going to start looking at procedures. So procedures and functions are a way of breaking up your code. So they're going to save you a heap loads of time. So they are basically a way of repeating code so that you don't have to keep using the same lines of code. So we're going to have a look at this now. So imagine if you had this block of code, and every time something updated in a game, whether you touched a character, whether you touched a wall, you had to display the lives and the time left and the player's score. That's going to get annoying, and it's also going to give you inefficient coding because you're going to have to repeat this over and over and over. This is where procedures and functions come in. Now, you could do a procedure for this, and this will save you from having to do the code over and over. So what you've got here is an example of a procedure. So I define the procedure that I need to do, and it just carries out those 3 lines of code. So every time that I need to update the score, I just run update score, and that's all I need to do. And that will save me from copying and pasting these 3 lines of code each time something happens in my game. Now, moving on from that, we have something called a function. Now, functions are similar to procedures, but they allow us to actually pass values into them, and we can also take values out of them. So here's an example of a function. Now what you can see here is we've got our function and it returns a value called area. We've created our function called area of circle, and what we've got is a value that we can pass into it called radius. Now this value has been passed into it when it's been used down here. So if I print the area of the circle is, I've got the actual function that I've called and I'm passing in this value, circle radius, which I originally got from the input. I'm passing that value in as a parameter so that it can be used in working out the area. So remember, functions can take in parameters and they also return values. Now the difference between a procedure and a function is that a function returns a value, a procedure does not. It's just a simple number of lines of code that you can reuse. But remember, they both share the same thing in that they can be reused over and over and over. Arithmetic. So when you are doing your programming, you are actually able to use arithmetic operators so that you can add, divide, multiply, and these are important that you know which ones to use so that you can carry out the correct code in your exam. So we have add, divide, subtract, multiply, greater than, less than, assignment, which you may have seen earlier when you said name equals Ray, and is equal to if you're doing some if statements, if you're doing some selection. So there's some of the operators that you will see from time to time. We also have Boolean, so if you want to make something true or false when you have two outcomes, you might use this in a while loop when the score has reached 10. So here's an example of the assignment operator being used. So you could actually say that number A is equal to 4, number B is equal to 8. You can see here that when I have a string, I put speech marks around the text. Here's an example of true being used. So you could say if something is true or false, but notice the assignment there. And you can actually do this for multiple variables by actually separating them with a comma. So if I wanted to allocate the number 50 to all of these, I could just simply do the same. String handling example here. So you've got first name equals Ray in speech marks, surname equals Chambers, and what I can actually do is have a variable called full name, and I can combine both of those by using the plus operator. So I could join both of those together. String handling is important. You need to be able to do this because in many of the exam questions they ask you to repeat stuff back. So I might have something in speech marks plus another variable, okay? File handling is also important. You need to know how to actually write and read from a file. So just to finish off, I'm going to show you some examples of reading and writing to a file. So this is what the code looks like to write information, and this is the pseudocode you will be expected to write in your exam. So I need to open and choose the file name and make sure it is in write mode. If I wanted to write a piece of information to the file, this is an example of me writing two fields of information. And then you must remember to close the file afterwards. Pay attention to the capital letters because these pieces of information must be in caps. And just to finish off, we also have read mode if you are reading information from the file. So I hope that's been really useful. If you found this video useful, please subscribe and watch future videos. This is just a quick video on procedural programming. Please refer to the exam questions that we have done in lessons and go over those past questions. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening, guys.